So that's the customer's part. Where this gets much more complicated is when you start worrying about how much someone uses the service. And in telecoms specifically, and I'm sure there are other analogs to this, but in telecoms, there are two different measures of how much do you use a service. So there is instantaneously, how much do you use in terms of what bandwidth do you need? And the other measure is in terms of cumulative volume, how much data do you need or will you transfer over a period of time? So the demand dialogue has two different ways of working. Well, technically three, but usually two. So it has inputs where you can talk about a traffic volume, which traditionally started off as being call minutes, because this is how plain old telephony was always done. You knew how many minutes you used because that's what you were billed on. And once you knew how many minutes you had, you'd then estimate your Erlangs by looking at the number of minutes over the usual calculation. So you could enter a number of call minutes as a volume, and using some assumptions about the distribution of that traffic over the time, you could then infer that your busy hour traffic was a certain number of Erlangs. In the broadband world, it's very different. In the broadband world, people tend to be more cognizant of how fast their connection is and how much they use it, and very rarely have a clue as to how much data they actually shift until they reach their cap, at which point they get frustrated. So, so basically, I don't want to spend too long on this because we haven't really got time. It's written up in the online help. Basically, you can enter a traffic volume and leave this distribution saying volume driven, and STEM will then work out your busy hour traffic. Or what we're going to do in this model is we're going to work the other way around. We're actually going to change the traffic calculation from being volume driven to being peak driven. And what that means is that actually STEM will look to the busy hour traffic inputs to be the start of the calculation, and it will then calculate the volume based on what you put in as the data rate in conjunction with what you say about how much the service is actually used. So in this particular case, we're asked to offer a 100 megabit per second service. So down here, even though I've written it as 100 megabits, my experience always tells me to go up one with my units, and I'll explain why in a minute. So I'm actually going to work with gigabits per second rather than megabits per second. So that means that my nominal bandwidth is actually 0.1 gigabits.
Right.
And I'm going to leave this contention ratio with a default value of 10. And what that basically means is that as the operator, I'm going to assume that even though I'm offering a nominal 100 megabits per second, I'm assuming that my customers aren't using that service full on by any means, and that I can get away with only a tenth of that on average at the first point of aggregation. And the first point of aggregation, you'll recall, is that edge router. And basically, in terms of how fast the uplink device needs to go, it only needs to go as fast as the aggregate across the customers at that location. And the assumption is that when they come together, there is a significant efficiency where, you know, one customer uses it for a bit and then goes off and makes a cup of tea. Next customer uses it a bit and then does something different. And another customer only ever uses it a small amount. And so the assumption is that on average, actually, this customer will only on average be generating 10 megabits per second. Right. So when STEM aggregates, it will effectively be dividing this by 10 to get the effective traffic.
Right.
Now, I did mention briefly that there is a third mode, and you can also choose independent. I'm not going to do it. If you choose independent, then STEM expects you to define both the busy hour traffic and the traffic volume, and it treats them as independent quantities. But I can tell you that I've hardly ever been in a situation where that was a valid thing to do, because they are very rarely, well, obviously they're never truly independent. I think it was some kind of video context where for some reason it was easier to do them as separate quantities. I think actually, I think actually we did it because a particular client had hard data for both the bandwidth and the volume, and had no straightforward way to relate them, and just said, look, I want to define them, both of them. I said, okay, we'll do this then. Usually it's good enough to calculate one from the other. And actually in this model, and in fact, very often with broadband models, very often you actually don't care what the volume is, because unless you're charging by the gigabyte, then really no one cares. All you care about is, does it go fast enough?
Right.